All right, good morning. Thank you. Okay. Right, I trust that our studies into the minor prophets have been fruitful so far. But I thought we'll take a little break from the minor prophets today. So we're going to jump back into the New Testament and we're going to have a look at Jesus' parables. Most of us are very familiar with the parables of Jesus. Parables in the form of stories take up fully 1/3 of the teachings of Jesus. And if you include parables that are acted out, we call them enacted parables, such as the one on, where he asked Peter to fish and then get a coin out of it, or lessons that are direct actions from the direct actions of Jesus, like cursing a fig tree. We can go as high as 60%. So to be sure, parables were not invented by Jesus. Philosophers and prophets and rabbis, have always been using parables and stories to illustrate truths for a long time. From the time of Jesus to hundreds of years after that, there have been recorded 4,000 parables preserved in classical rabbinic literature, but none of the rabbis can hold a candle to the stories that Jesus told. Jesus' stories are sophisticated and layered and can reveal much about our hearts and about God and about kingdom living if we pay attention. But as with all things, familiarity breeds boredom. If we have heard or read these parables since young, they become predictable and colorless. We think we know the main point of the stories, and then we miss the rich lessons that we could have received from them. Well, at least that's my own experience. My first encounter with parables was when I was a teenager taking Bible knowledge as an O-level subject. I remember being fascinated by these stories. My Bible knowledge teacher was also my literature teacher, so she was very good. She opened my mind to the meanings of these parables and the messages, and their messages to the original audience. But I was young and ignorant, so I did not pay much attention to what they mean in my life, except that I could get an easy A1 for learning this subject. No, that's not my point, okay? But as the years pass, I have read and heard these parables many times. They become familiar to me, and the characters and the words lose their original meanings. I assume I have already plumbed the depths of their meaning, so they will lose their power in changing me. So now I'm no longer young, but I'm just a little less ignorant than I was as a teenager about the parables. Still, the parables have lost their power on me. So I'm in the process of recovering the power so that they can speak to me about God and about living in His kingdom. I started reading a couple of books about parables, and they're beginning to rekindle the original fascination I had with parables. I hope to share some of these things I've learned so far, but as I will explain in a little while, most of the digging must be done by the reader yourselves. So I was listening to a podcast on parables, and the speaker said quite accurately, there's a certain irony in teaching about parables, because parables are meant to be discovered by the listeners themselves. In explaining them, I would have stolen the process of discovery from you. It's just like jokes, right? A joke is no longer funny if it has to be explained. However, as the speaker also said, we are far removed in history and geography and culture from the original audience. So we might need a little push in our journey of discovery, so perhaps it's necessary. In any case, Jesus told many parables, so I only have time to talk about one, so I won't steal your joy. You can still go on to discover other parables for yourselves. Also, every parable might speak differently to different ones of us at different times. So let's start with the basic. What is a parable? The word parable comes from the Greek word parabola or parabole. The term is a compound word derived from two Greek words, meaning para meaning beside or alongside. Bola or balo means to throw or to cast. So perhaps that's where we get the word ball, right? Together, parabole literally means a placing beside or a comparison. It refers to the act of setting two things side by side in order to compare them, which is precisely what a parable does. It compares a story or a situation with a spiritual meaning. Parables are the natural expression of a mind that sees truth in concrete pictures rather than conceives it in abstractions. So concrete versus abstract. So we use a lot of abstract terms, terms that don't really have that are quite difficult to grasp. So parables, in a way, expresses such things, such abstractions or abstract concepts in concrete terms, okay, pictures. So it could be a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, right? A metaphor is when you say, something is, is a house or is a rock, that kind of thing. So it's like putting the two things together. The abstract is the concrete object or the concrete thing. Simile is as something as fast as a leopard or something, okay? So no, I'm not doing a literature lesson, okay? But there are a lot of literary concepts and ideas in parables. So from literature, from nature, or from common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. So you get this idea that that it gets us to think more, to really explore, as I'll talk about it later. Snodgrass, another author, compares parables to poems. And he quoted a modern prophet, Marianne Moore, who described poems as imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So this is quite vivid, right? I mean, it's an imaginary garden, but there's a real toad there. So parables are about real everyday things and people, such as making bread, looking for lost things like coins, day laborers at vineyards, building of barns, banquets, and such, which are common and mundane and relatable to people then. Nothing very religious about them in terms of their concepts and the language, but real and not imaginary toads, okay, like what the author said. So if they are about real things that we come into contact with every day, we would think that they will be quite easy to grasp and understand, right? But nothing could be further from the truth. Let's look at what Jesus said about his parables. When his disciples came to him in Matthew 13, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" Jesus replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." Jesus is quoting from Isaiah. Doesn't sound very encouraging, right? I mean, was he saying that he spoke in parables so that some of us will not understand? Almost sounds as if he was deliberately making it difficult for his hearers. So the question is, did Jesus purposefully hide the secrets of the kingdom through parables? Did he make understanding difficult so that some of us who might otherwise have understood plain language cannot understand? But I propose that more often than not, such indirect methods work better than direct methods, than plain language. As a teacher, one of my key struggles is between teaching directly and as clearly as I can so that my students can get the concept immediately versus creating opportunities or activities for my students to construct their own meaning and their own understanding. The first is very appealing, and it challenges my own ability to explain clearly. And for sure, teachers among us, over the years, we do get better. But of course, there are also others who get worse, okay? Of course, it is also efficient, and it saves a lot of time. The second can be difficult and frustrating. But over the years, I have come to realize that the first may have been effective in producing short-term results. It does not help my students to become effective learners themselves, nor to learn deeply. And when students engage in a complex task, where they have to tease out the patterns and the meanings themselves, it becomes a transferable skill that allows them to solve problems themselves. I can then make myself irrelevant, at least for a short while. So in the first teaching paradigm, when my students say we don't understand, the ball comes into my court. And then I'm obliged to lob the ball back by providing another example or another illustration, or maybe use an analogy. There is this burning urge in me to teach until their eyes light up. And then they say, oh, I get it. Okay, then I feel good. Okay. But Jesus doesn't do that. When his hearers say, we don't understand, I imagine he might have said, that is correct. You don't understand. Period. Then they are left in the dark. There is at most 2 recorded, detailed explanations that Jesus gave with his own disciples. The first is the parable of the sower, which was a parable about why he teaches in parables. The other is the parable of the weeds. And then there are other couple of other instances of brief explanations. But by and large, he did not explain most of his parables. For Jesus, he knew that those who would not respond to parables would not have responded if he had spoken plainly anyway. They might have become even more defensive. So I think about myself, when someone challenges me directly and tells me I'm wrong, my first defense or response will be defensiveness, and then perhaps denial. So parables in an unexpected, gracious way might allow me to see myself reflected in one or more of the characters, like a mirror. As we have seen earlier in the root word of parable, it is a story that is thrown and then it rolls along to us. And we're supposed to pick it up and ask, what is this doing here? We are supposed to ask questions, and we are supposed to think and imagine all the different things that is happening in the story. Eugene Peterson, in his book Tell It Slant, said parables appear in quick, precise strokes, but a parable is feeble. Almost all of the power is in the one who hears it. So we need to acknowledge that there is a message in there for each one of us. But our natural tendency sometimes is to read a parable and then look for places where it relates to other people, maybe our enemy, somebody we dislike. But looking deeper and applying it to ourselves, sometimes it's a little bit difficult. But that is only the initial stage, right? Because I may just stop at self-knowledge, even if I acknowledge that it applies to me. And then it becomes a private treasure to me. Beyond using the parable as a mirror, Sidney Harris, American journalist, said, the whole object of education is to turn mirrors into windows. Okay, Kenneth Bailey, another author that I like very much, also said, if the parable is a house in which the listener or the reader is invited to take up residence. Then that person is urged by the parable to look on the world through the window of that residence. So I imagine that a parable is a house that I now live in. I walk around the house, explore the various rooms, go to the kitchen, go to the attic, maybe go down to the basement. Our basement, no windows, okay. And look through them to the outside world. And I start to reflect on how I relate to the outside world and how I can be part of it. So, after such a long introduction to what parables are, I have only time to discuss one parable, as I said, okay? So I draw most of my material from these two books, one by Kenneth Bailey, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and the second by Eugene Peterson, Tell It Slant. Eugene Peterson is the guy who wrote The Message, right? The Bible. Very, very down-to-earth language. So the parable that I want to talk about is the parable of the shrewd manager. Right, this is an image that I generated by Qwen 2.5, China Chat GPT, okay? Very powerful, and it's free for now. So let's read the parable in all its entirety. Okay, it's a parable found in Luke chapter 16. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager anymore. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil. He replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat. He replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. Now the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now, if you find this parable strange, you will not be alone. Most scholars and commentators throughout history have had trouble with it. In fact, in the 4th century, Julian, a Roman emperor who was after the time of Constantine, who also turned the whole Roman Empire into a Christian state. So Julian turned away from Christianity because of this parable. He used this parable as his primary text for rejecting Christianity, because he said the parable taught Jesus' followers to be liars and thieves. And then he said Roman morals are actually better. So he left. And I don't know what happened to, the whole Roman Empire is supposed to be Christian, right? But the emperor is not. The title for this parable is The Shrewd Manager. But other translations, such as NASB, have titled it The Dishonest Manager. But titles are not part of the original text, but both words appear in verse 8, right? The Greek word for unrighteous is adikia, right? Shown there. In the New Testament, this word means, it's often used to describe moral wrongness, wickedness, iniquity, highlighting a deviation from divine law and ethical conduct. But the other one, the word shrewd, the Greek word is phronimos. Again, used in New Testament to describe someone who is wise and prudent, sensible. It refers to a person who demonstrates practical wisdom and discernment, particularly in spiritual or moral matters. Wisdom is not merely intellectual, but is deeply connected to one's character and actions, reflecting a life lived in accordance with God's will. So, we're left with this contradiction, right? One is negative, the other is positive. Both applied to the manager. So what's going on here? But without even looking at these two words, we're left in no doubt as to the morals of the manager when you read the story. He first wasted his master's goods, which was the first reason why he was dismissed in the first place. And then, after he was dismissed, before he returned his accounts book, he went on to lose even more money, all without the master's knowledge. Okay, Eugene Peterson's title for this parable was The Rascal. Okay. Well, the master didn't know all this until he returned the books. And he did all this for his own self-interest, right? To secure himself, a job as a manager. He doesn't want to dig, manual labor. It's not for him. He doesn't want to beg. He's too proud for that. So what are some questions we'll naturally ask as a listener or a reader? Imagine yourself as his audience. Verse 1 says Jesus told his disciples this parable. So his primary audience is his own disciples. But if you read further after verse 9, in verse 14, apparently his disciples were not the only ones listening in. The Pharisees too were listening in. So we can assume that Jesus' primary audience was his disciples, but often because the location of teaching was in public and others, including the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, would listen in, but for a different purpose, more often, to see if they could catch him saying things that they could indict him for. So, before we answer the questions, some cultural background first. First century context of this parable would have been an agricultural one, okay, in case you think that it is a banking kind of a situation, a banker and his manager. But the master was probably a landowner who leased his land out to farmers who grew different crops on these lands. So payment terms were usually in kind, which could be whatever they grew, right? Such as, you saw in the story, the payment was in olive oil and wheat. So the manager helped his master manage his finances and collect rent in kind. Another important thing we need to take into consideration is that of the community in the first century. Although the community in many of the parables are usually off stage, they are very much part of the story. For example, who brought the news to the master? We are not told, but we can safely assume that his friends in the community must have heard about what the manager is like and have come to warn him about. That says a lot about the master. He must have been a trusted and respected member of the community. There is no hint of any criticism in the parable about his character. If he were a rascal, the community would not have bothered to report to him. In the parables of Jesus, there are usually two major characters. One would be righteous, the other one would be a crook, right? But never is there any parable where both are crooks, okay, partners in crime. So, thirdly, in traditional setting in the ancient Middle East, even up to today, there is this strong honor-shame culture. That means if you don't publicly dismiss your manager or your worker immediately, because it would have been seen as shameful for both the employer and the worker or the manager. Instead, there will be likely to be private conversations, discussions, warnings, opportunities for the manager to justify and to, and to prove that he's innocent. So anyone in authority is not expected to dismiss an ordinary servant, let alone a manager, without days of negotiation. If the manager is innocent, he might have pleaded with his master and protest over his unfair dismissal. So it is telling that the manager is silent because he's guilty as charged. As he sits in silence in his room, contemplating his next move, what are some thoughts that would have run through his mind? We shall return to his thoughts a little later. His master has fired him and asked for his account books. By right, the manager no longer has any authority to do anything. But he still holds on to the account books, which will be the source of his authority. And we conclude that his master has not told anyone else apart from him, including the other servants, because he could still call in his master's debtors. How does he do that? One way is to go directly and call them in, but we would imagine, being the manager, he has got other servants under him, so he still has the ability to command them or to tell them, to instruct them to go and get the debtors in, one at a time. Okay, and the debtors, they came willingly, right? Thinking that this manager must still be in charge. If not, they wouldn't have come in to him. And then, one at a time, he tells them to reduce their debts, and they are supposed to write in their own hands the new amounts, right? Presumably to make it legitimate. They must have been thinking in their minds, the master must have instructed the manager to do this generous thing. In the first century in Middle East, 900 gallons of olive oil was roughly equivalent to 3 years' worth of wages for an average laborer work. So half of that is 1.5 years. It's a huge amount. So the reduction was a very, very significant one. Bailey quoted Ibn al-Tayyib, okay, who was a theologian and philosopher who practiced medicine in Baghdad. Okay, he has this. He sort of rewrote or imagined this parable, which says, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50." And he says, this means, sit down before my master takes these bills from me, and write 50 instead of 100. And as for the extra 50, they will be divided between the two of us after this is over. Why would he do that? Well, brilliant. It's to hold the debtor ransom, since they are now partners in crime. They would not now go to the master and expose him prematurely before he could finish going through all of them, not without also terminating the business partnership. And the manager might even get to blackmail some of them into giving him a job later. Publicly, the debtors can maintain that they thought all this is legal. And they go back and then they share the good news with their family, the villagers, and then when it becomes public knowledge that the landlord is such a generous man, and the manager is such a fantastic worker who convinced his master to make the huge reductions in their rent, there is no more going back. When the master receives his books and he notes the changes recorded in the handwritings of his business partners, he has two choices. Legally, he can go to the village and explain that the reductions are not authorized. But he might be interrupting a party in celebration of his generosity. And from the reputation of being one generous landlord, he would hence become the brunt of the anger of all the villagers. Or he could remain silent, pay the price for the clever rascal's actions, and continue to enjoy his reputation as a generous man. So, we now consider is this master really that generous? Really as generous as his reputation is? And I want to do it by way of returning to the point where the manager is fired. This is not from the ChatGPT. Okay, it's some nice image that I got. They don't say where they get this, or the writers or the authors or the painters or of these images. So I can't. It's hard for me to acknowledge. And then he sits quietly in his room contemplating his next move. Must have been a shock to him. After all, he has probably done this for years without getting caught. Suddenly, he realizes that his good life is all over. But slowly, but increasingly, another realization must have struck him that the master has not thrown him straight into jail. Why? Surely what he has done deserves that. Oh, wait. He also has not asked me to repay him or sell my family to recoup his losses. Why? He only asked for his account books, and sounds like he's going to ask me to just walk away. And then he gets up. He walks around the household to gauge whether the news has spread among the servants. Everyone seems to be normal. The servants still appear deferential to him. They still take instructions from him. No one has been told. He goes back to his room to think. In the moments of that silence, his entire life turns around. He enters into and experiences a world he has never known before, a world of grace. Eugene Peterson says this. Kenneth Bailey continued, this servant has experienced two aspects of his master's nature. He is a master who expects obedience and acts in judgment on the disobedient servant. He dismissed him. But he is also a master who shows unusual mercy and generosity, even to a dishonest steward. The thoughtful listener or reader of the parable would not miss either of these facts. So we see the main gist of the story, or one of the main things that we can learn from the story. I've always read this story focusing on the shrewd manager, and I cannot reconcile the fact that Jesus praised him for his dishonest act and called him shrewd. But I have never really focused on the master. So reading this really helped me to change my focus on the master instead of the manager. Of course, they are both main characters, because Jesus also, in the end, praised the manager for for what he did. Let's go back to the parable. In verses 8b to 9, Jesus distinguishes between the people of this world and the people of the light. Who are the people of the world? The non-believers and people who have not come into the light. People of the light clearly refers to believers and his disciples. He says that these people of the world knows and they are shrewd in being able to use their resources to build friendships or for their own purposes. So he's using this to teach his disciples to also use their resources, materially or not. They may not be rich, but they have resources too, to fulfill God's purpose for the world. And Jesus did say wealth has a high potential to corrupt, but people of the light can also use it for kingdom purposes. We need to tread carefully around wealth because it can corrupt, but we don't have to shun it blindly as if wealth in and of itself is evil. So at this point, we're going to move beyond the parable. I'm going to refer us to what comes immediately before this parable in Luke chapter 15. Do you all know which parable that is? parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. If you put these two stories side by side, or one immediately after the other, these two parables seem to have come from very, very different worlds. The story of the lost brothers, or the lost son, and their compassionate father touches emotions that are deep within us. The father doesn't deserve either of the sons. One tells him to die before his actual time, which is essentially what he did when he asked for his inheritance, and then he squanders it in wild living. The other obeys him only in his actions, but truly doesn't love him in the heart. He snubs him in front of his guests when his younger son comes back. And all through the story, the father's love shines through. From his undignified sprint down the village road to intercept his younger son from being caught by the villagers and being cut off from the community. I think I've shared about this before. You know, that they have a ritual where they will smash a pot, you know, in front of the wayward son of the village. And that signifies that you're cut off now completely, forever from the village. So the father, you know, knowing that such a ritual would happen before the son steps into the village, that's the reason why he ran, you know, that he runs to the son to intercept such a ritual, because he wants to, you know, welcome the son back and to forgive him. So that's for the younger son. And then after that, shamelessly he goes out to plead with his older son, who refused to come into the house because he was angry with the father and the son, the younger son. He pleads with him shamelessly for him to come back into the house so that they can reunite as a family. What not to love about this parable? We cannot get enough of it. But what about the shrewd manager? We're usually repelled by it, or at best confused or disturbed. Perhaps the manager is too smart for his own good, and then we are usually quite wary about people like that. But sinners come in all shapes and sizes. The younger son, self-indulgent types. Older son, self-righteous types. And the manager, self-preserving types. We all can find ourselves reflected in each of them, or various combinations of them at different points of our lives. Jesus didn't judge each of them. Well, of course, there are consequences which they must face for their own sins. But what Jesus wanted was for each of them to find salvation of their own. And the salvation for all three lies at the expense of the father, the compassionate father in the lost sons, and in the case of the manager, his generous master. Here's a table, magic from ChatGPT. Well, no, not really ChatGPT. Alibaba Qwen 2.0, my favorite now, okay? Apart from a lot of censorship issues, because it's from China, it's pretty good. So, if you compare the prodigal son and the shrewd manager in different aspects, there are so many parallels. The main character is the younger son who squanders. The manager also squanders the master's resources. Initial sin and failure of the younger son, and the manager who was accused of wasting the master's possessions. Crisis point, they both hit rock bottom. The younger son who wanted to, eat the food that is fed to the pigs. And the manager who realizes that he's going to lose his job, but must act quickly. Strategic action, they both decided to do something, right? The younger son goes back, and the manager wants to save his own skin, right? At the expense of the master. Outcome of the action, father forgives and restores the son. And for the shrewd manager, the master surprises by commending his manager for shrewdness, even though his actions were self-serving. the underlying theme of grace, the Father's grace and forgiveness for the sons. They do not reap what they sow. And the master also did not jail the manager. He also did not reap what he sowed. The audience reaction, the older son reacting negatively out of jealousy and resentment. The Pharisees, which I didn't read, you can read it for yourself, reacting negatively to the teachers, to Jesus' teaching about wealth and relationships. And in the end, there was no end, right? No proper ending. We're not told what the elder brother does, and as we are also not told what happens to the manager. We, the listeners or the readers, are pulled into participating in the world of grace. What do? Eugene Peterson said, we don't do anything. It's not what we would expect from some religious teacher, right? He said, the stories leave us not with an agenda to do something, to make up for whatever we have done wrong, but with an invitation to receive salvation from the one who truly wants our whole selves and our whole being into a healing relationship with him. Finish off with some practicals in reading the parables. As I showed you just now, we started with examining the cultural and historical facets of parable. Because we're so far removed, we need sources, right? I mean, so both these authors are good. They are excellent resources for the historical, cultural background. And there are also some parables that have many connections to the Old Testament as well. Number 2, you wander around the parable. Feel free to notice things that are in the background. For example, the parable of the yeast or the baker, right? What are the hands doing in the parable of the yeast? Prodigal son, how far was the road home for the prodigal son? And what is going on in his mind all this while? In the Good Samaritan, how wide is the road from Jericho to Jerusalem to Jericho? We could also identify, right? We take turns. There are different characters in each parable. We could take turns to be different characters and imagine how they feel in each of the characters. But over and above all these, as we explore the parables, or pretty much any part of the Bible, allow the Spirit to help us to find the connections. In the end, it may distill to what the stories say about God, about us, and about how we can respond and live according to the will of our loving Master Jesus. So I hope this has been helpful, and this is my bibliography. Thank you.